by now, but last week I was in rough shape, you know? Last week I saw my doctor. I told him, Doc, every day I wake up, I look in the mirror, I want to throw up. What's wrong with me? He said, I don't know, but your eyesight is perfect.
Rodney Dangerfield had the face.
The face tells 1,000 stories. And here he is, these huge eyes.
The physique. And the material.
My life is dumb. See, not spot at all. It takes her an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes, okay?
This guy was a joke machine.
She made chocolate mousse and antler got stuck in my throat.
It's like Ali Frazier time.
Set up, punchline. Set up.
I'll tell you, all you hear is sex. With sex, I had it up to here.
Punchline.
Not lately, though.
Just when you didn't know you could laugh anymore, he'd just whack you with another one.
But Rodney's was not an overnight success. He struggled for over 30 years, even quitting the business to live a life outside of comedy.
Rodney became an aluminum siding salesman.
He didn't perform between the ages of 28 and 41.
But he continued to write jokes. So when he re-entered show business, he had a ton of material.
Boy, I mean, what a great comeback story. Then there was me.
Would you want Mr. Rodney Dangerfield?
It's the greatest name in the history of comedy.
His persona was so identifiable and so precise.
It was all up in here, and the tics and the shoulder.
And of all things, that wonderful line.
No respect. I don't got no respect at all.
That was it.
Nobody has a catchphrase like that.
Rodney became the biggest name in stand-up,
What a crowd.
TV, and movies.
What a night.
It's the trifecta. Another reason why he's a legend.
And used his success to help break a who's who of young comedians.
Bad Sam.
He's truly the godfather of comedy.
That's unbelievable, huh?
But with all the fame and fortune, it still wasn't easy being Rodney Dangerfield.
It's not easy being me.
Rodney taught me how to be rich, famous, and miserable.
He really was a tortured soul.
Other people wake up in the morning, new day, up and at 'em. I wake up, the heaviness is right there waiting for me.
Comedy was absolutely an escape for Rodney's pain. It was the only thing that really made him happy.
Probably the funniest man that ever breathed air.
Years from now, people look back at him and go, wow, this guy actually lived.
You know, people say to me, how did you get a name like Rodney Dangerfield? I'll tell you what happened. Hi. I saw your ad in the paper. I want to improve my personality.
Good luck. What's your name?
I'm Jack Roy.
Jack Roy. You got two first names. Your name is your biggest problem.
This is like a comeback for me in show business. I was in show business years ago and I quit. And to give you an idea how well I was doing at the time I quit, I was the only one who knew I quit. What's the name?
Rodney Dangerfield.
Rodney Dangerfield?
With a name like Rodney Dangerfield, you have to either be really funny or you have to be an idiot. And you were really funny as Rodney Dangerfield.
If you look at his image and his material and the way he dressed, the way he conducted himself, the name Rodney Dangerfield just fit.
Suppose I use the name, I don't like it. Can I bring it back?
Okay, just do me one favor. While you're using the name, don't give it a bad name.
This persona is what made this man special.
What a crowd, what a crowd.
Rodney was totally unique. He was a different kind of performer. There was never one like that before, and there's never been one like that since.
He was funny, and he was every man. And Rodney Dangerfield, if he was anything else, was authentic.
Rodney's jokes were all true. They were all based on his real perception of himself.
I tell you, it's not easy being me.
And this whole thing, it's not easy being me. It wasn't. He always felt someone was trying to take advantage of him.
I tell you, can't get help today.
Or going to betray him, or, you know, that he'd been somehow wronged. And that just was something from his childhood. He's so wronged by his parents that he could never overcome it.
Tonight,
I don't believe this.
Rodney Dangerfield, comedian, actor, the man who from coast to coast gets no respect. This is your life.
When I was born, the doctor told my mother I did all I could, but he pulled through anyway.
Rodney Dangerfield was born Jacob Cohen on November 22, 1921, in Babylon, Long Island.
But one thing about Babylon, the population never changes. Every time a kid is born, some guy leaves town, you know?
He was the second child of Phil, a vaudeville performer, and Dorothy, a housewife. Dorothy was Phil's second wife. When she became pregnant with Rodney's older sister, Marion, Phil did the honorable thing, and he and Dorothy were married.
I told my old man, never took me to the zoo. He said, if they want you, they'll come and get you.
He was born a really poor, rejected kid. His father, who adopted the stage name Roy, was on a comedy team in vaudeville and always on the road.
Rodney's dad was absent from his life, which was a real source of heartache for Rodney.
His father saw him twice a year for about 2 30-minute visits.
What a childhood I had. My mother never breastfed me. She told me she liked me as a friend.
His mother, a beautiful Hungarian Jew, couldn't stand him, didn't even tend him, hardly even babysat him.
He told me she never gave him a hug or a kiss or even a compliment.
Last week I looked up my family tree. I found out I'm the sap.
He was really left to just go play in the backyard, and there'd be half a sandwich on the porch, and he had to fend for himself.
He told me he was 5 years old, and strange men were asking him into cars and kissing him for a nickel. It was a sad existence for him.
His mother didn't necessarily encourage that, but she wasn't keeping an eye on him. And he drifted away and was able to earn that nickel for, he didn't know how long it went on in his memory. He said it could have been weeks, could have been months. And he's blocked the time period out mercifully.
Growing up was, you know, you said that it was kind of a depression time and there wasn't a lot of money. But were you basically happy? Did you have a good time?
No. So I was interested in survival when I was a kid.
Even though his mother didn't show him much affection, it didn't stop him from being a loyal, devoted son. He worked at a newsstand before school, when he was in grade school, and he took every job he could get his hands on and was actually the breadwinner of the family.
He was starved for affection, attention. He tried to do good things. He worked very hard to get good grades, and he presented his mother with a report card.
She wouldn't even look at it. She just says, give me that sign, and she says, you know what you got to do. Well, who are you trying to get good marks for if your mother don't want to look at it?
In 1929, the Great Depression hit New York. Money was tight, so Rodney's father, Phil, arranged for the family to live with his mother in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the East Bronx. Phil, however, stayed in his own apartment in New York City.
He had different experiences with his mother, actually stealing money from him growing up and doing things that Rodney thought were maybe not of the highest morals. But he started getting the sense that maybe his father stayed away not because of him, but maybe it was because of her.
When Rodney was 12, his mother wanted to be close to her sister Pearlie, so she moved the family to a one-bedroom flat in the more affluent Kew Gardens in Queens.
As a kid, I had nothing. I was poor, really poor. I was so poor, my rich aunt died in a will. I owed her $20.
There are really two parts to Kew Gardens. On one side of Lefferts Boulevard, you had the private homes. On the side of Lefferts Boulevard, where I lived, and he did too, there were a lot of rent-control apartments and, was lower middle class.
Rodney was delivering groceries basically to his classmates and felt a little embarrassed about that. But more than feeling inferior, he learned how insensitive other people can be.
He did not fit in there, but he didn't fit in anywhere, really.
His Aunt Pearlie and Rodney's older sister were going to the movies, and he begged them to go. Aunt Pearlie said, well, if you scrub up, you can go. So he ran up the stairs and washed his face and hands. And he came back down, and they were halfway down the block laughing and running away from him. And he screamed out, please, I want to go, please, I want to go, and they never came back.
It's into your soul from a youth. If you feel that nothing goes right, you weren't treated right, it stays with you till the end, you know? And your gut feelings are there they're put into you when you're young, and you don't change. You are what you are.
It's clearly a case of depression with heartbreaking, significant episodes of abandonment and humiliation and the coldest sort of neglect.
Comedy was absolutely an escape for Rodney's pain. He actually got his first laugh at 5 years old. He was still hungry after dinner and told his mother that he'd like some more food. And she said, well, you've had sufficient. And he said, I didn't even have any fish. And sadly, everybody laughed, but he noticed that that mood lifted, and he never forgot that. And kind of spent the rest of his life trying to get that good feeling back.
I was very unhappy. So you try to think of comedy relief. So you try to think of some way to write a funny joke or get a funny thought, and just to break up the how unhappy you are, I guess.
Was he always the class clown, in fact?
He always was. This fellow was born to make people laugh. Always did.
When you hear laughter, instead of resenting everyone in the world, you suddenly say, hey, people aren't that bad. You know, they get me.
He told me many times that when he would get laughter from the audience, that was the closest warm feeling he could compare to love.
And his entire artistic drive was to get even with his childhood.
But Rodney's initial strike into showbiz would prove to be filled with failure and bitter disappointment. At the age of 15, Rodney Dangerfield began writing jokes in an effort to combat his unhappy childhood. 3 years later, he took a cue from his father, a vaudeville performer named Phil Roy, and started his comedic career under the stage name Jack Roy, in the hopes of becoming a professional comedian, like his childhood idols W.C. Fields, Groucho Marx, and Laurel and Hardy.
Rodney's father was certainly absent from his life, but Rodney always longed to have a relationship with him. So when Rodney started doing amateur nights, he decided to use the name Jack Roy.
He was doing his act to heal some wounds that were very deep and carved into his soul very early. And it was not to get his dad's attention or his approval. It was just for approval and affection.
When I started out in show business, I could get a job as a comedian. I became a singing waiter, you know. Starts to sing, and people throw money at you, so you have to learn to sing. So.
It all started when he was working as a young man in a club in Brooklyn called the Polish Falcon. And when the comic got off stage one evening, he got up and did a few jokes.
Those first few jokes Rodney hoped would be his introduction into the world of professional comedy. But show business would soon prove to be a very difficult profession.
Boy, what a racket. You don't know what you go through in show business. You're a kid in show business. At the time, I was a kid and doing what the kids do. I lacked maturity. I lacked an image.
When Rodney started in show business as Jack Roy, he didn't know what he was doing yet. He sang on stage. He even used props for a while. He didn't know what type of a comedian he wanted to be.
As Jack Roy, he was really doing impressions. Humphrey Bogart and Cary Grant and Jimmy Durante. And they weren't that good, really.
This is just the era before television. Rodney would work all the joints. There were 300 nightclubs throughout the 5 boroughs and New Jersey. Little supper clubs, all the way up to Barbara Walters' father's place, the Latin Casino, Lou Walters. The Latin Casino was the top.
Very happy to be here tonight.
Milton Berle would headline for $5,000 a week. That's what the scene was like in the late 1940s.
With so many venues to play, there was no shortage of opportunity. But while comedians like Bob Hope, Red Skelton, Jack Benny, and Martin Lewis were enjoying great success, Rodney continued to struggle.
These are all known as jokes, what I'm doing here.
Jack Roy was also known as Mad Jack. Mad Jack comes from his attitude. He was angry on the street all the time.
I said, what are you so mad about? You don't know what I go through, Eddie. Every day it's something else. This agent and this girl and this club owner, can't they see I'm funny? He said, I'll tell you, I appealed to everyone who could do me absolutely no good.
He was an angry man, but a sweet angry man. At that time, you worked joints. You'd change your clothes in the toilet, and you were lucky you got $5 to $15 a night.
And they featured acts like fire eaters and knife throwers and strippers.
Well, every night the boss would say the same thing to me. Be funny. My people come here to forget their troubles. I mean, how do you make a guy forget he's up for manslaughter, you know?
He told me that one time he was playing some tough joint, and in the middle of Rodney's act, the piano player kind of fell asleep and hit the keys. So Rodney made a joke about it. Oh, man, look, I'm putting the piano player to sleep. After the show was over, the one brother in the tuxedo called the piano player over and punched him right in the face. And, you know, just don't you ever do that again. You know, and Rodney's by the other brother who's eating a big hero sandwich. Man, what did he have to hit him for? He didn't have to hit him. Nobody got hit. He fell down.
When he first started out, he did these longer kind of stoned hipster raps without punchlines. He was very inspired by what Lenny Bruce had kind of innovated.
As Jack Roy, his delivery, his subject matter was a sort of cult. He didn't perform the way the majority of other comics perform. He was just a little angry that he didn't achieve the success as Jack Roy that he felt he deserved.
It was now 1949, and at the age of 28, Rodney had been at it for close to 10 years with nothing to show for his efforts but disappointment.
Well, I never saw him happy. He was always complaining. He was always complaining about this or that. And it sounded like a routine, but it wasn't a routine.
Life away from the stage was no better as he began to battle depression, an affliction he would never fully conquer.
Rodney suffered depression his whole life. He wasn't kidding. He was a depressed guy. He was down.
I mean, this afternoon I was in a bar. They told me to get out. They wanted to start the happy hour.
He had a heavy head. He had a very tough childhood, you know, with his mother. They were not very close.
I know that he had a lot of pain and a lot of negative experiences as a child, and he would cry about it. He would well up with tears and be very, very upset about these memories.
My psychiatrist told me I'm going crazy. I said to him, if you don't mind, I'd like a second opinion. He said, all right, you're ugly, too.
It's a funny line, but you can see right beneath the surface, there's a lot of pain there. And that's pretty much his story.
Rodney continued to write jokes to deal with his unhappiness, hoping he could turn his showbiz fortunes around, but his career continued to go nowhere. In his personal life, though, things began to look up when he met a young jazz singer named Joyce Indig.
He met her on a date where she was singing, and he was the performer on the show, and they drove home together, and they started dating.
She was quite lovely. She looked like an actress, and Rodney was very much in love with her.
So they had something in common. Rodney was in show business, she was in show business, and they had a talent, and so they got along.
She was, besides being obviously attractive, she paid a lot of attention to Rodney. He knew that she loved him.
While Rodney and Joyce's relationship continued to grow stronger, their showbiz aspirations stalled. The frustration finally became too much for Rodney.
The most important thing you do in your life as a comedian is when you're on stage, and you judge yourself personally. When you bomb or die on stage, it's just, it just takes your soul out. And you think, I should never have been in this business.
After nearly 10 years of trying to make it in comedy, Rodney Dangerfield decided he was finished with show business.
That's it, folks, the end of the line.
They made a promise to one another. They were going to get married and quit this nonsense show business.
With showbiz behind them, Rodney and Joyce were married. It was a decision they would both come to regret. At the age of 28, Rodney Dangerfield, then known as Jack Roy, quit comedy after nearly 10 years of struggling in small clubs in and around New York City. He fell in love with and married jazz singer Joyce Indig, and they made a promise to each other to settle down and forego their showbiz aspirations.
Rodney went out and became an aluminum siding salesman in the 1950s. And a lot of comedians made day money selling aluminum siding across the river in New Jersey. And Dangerfield was an excellent aluminum siding salesman.
He believed that making the customer like you was an important part of getting the sale. And so he kind of, used his humor to help him get his foot in the door.
I lived in a town called Bergenfield, New Jersey, and my best friend, Mark Levine, his parents' claim to fame was that Rodney Dangerfield did the aluminum siding on their house. And he told Murray and Gloria Levine, I'm going to be a stand-up. And he told them a joke about an egg.
Sex with me, that's ridiculous. My wife makes love to me, there's always a reason for it. One night she used me to time an egg.
So he tells them that joke and gets in his car and drives away. And Mrs. Levine goes, Murray, he'll never make it.
When he was out of show business, working this square gig as a aluminum siding salesman and living in the suburbs and going on the road and taking orders, lining up contractors, carrying around contracts with a briefcase, coming home to a wife, it just wasn't his scene. And probably to dull the pain of that monotony and also dull the pain of his very sad and tragic childhood, he continued to write jokes.
And he kept a duffel bag in his bedroom at home. And he would just write funny jokes, funny jokes, funny jokes. For 11 years, he filled up this duffel bag with funny jokes.
Well, the other night I felt like having a few drinks. I went over to the bartender and said, surprise me. He showed me a naked picture of my wife.
Those jokes, he thought, might someday help him get back on stage, doing what he really loved, making people laugh. But for the next 12 years, he lived the life of the everyman, working an unsatisfying 9-to-5 job.
Siding wasn't a way of life he enjoyed.
Can you imagine him selling siding? I mean, that had to be scary. Hey, how you doing? Hey, how are you? How many square footage you have? Oh, I'll tell you, it must be freezing during the winter. Then he'd go home and he'd want to take his life.
Rodney was actually a very effective salesman and made a good living for him and Joyce. But comedy was in his blood, and he couldn't shake the call of the stage.
I went into a little club called the Duplex. He got up and said what I considered was some clever, funny things. And he explained to me that he would come down to a club just to get the feel of performing again, like a fighter might go to a gymnasium to work out.
If you love being a stand-up comedian, you will go year after year after year standing in front of an audience of 7 people to 500 people to thousands, telling jokes. You have to be willing not to be famous, then you can have a successful career.
Joyce kept her promise. She quit the business. Rodney, Jack Roy, still had the bug in him to perform.
Rodney's nightly performances weren't bringing in any money, so to pay the bills, he continued to sell siding. In 1959, Rodney and Joyce welcomed son Brian into their family. But the newborn wasn't the answer to what was becoming a strained relationship.
I met Joyce, and she was not in favor of this new idea of Rodney going to work, telling jokes and writing jokes. And he said, Joyce, this fellow's with the William Morris agent, he thinks I'm funny, and he thinks he could book me. And Joyce said, well, you seem like a nice fellow, but you know, you're breaking up my marriage.
That doesn't help a marriage, you know, because she was out of show business. Had she been able to stay in show business, maybe they would have had some kind of a compatibility there. But, you know, they were going on opposite ends.
Well, lately she started something new, you know. Before she goes to sleep for hours, she puts on vanishing cream. And sometimes I wish it worked.
After a very unhappy childhood, he seemed to have a very unhappy marriage. Whether the woman wasn't just for him or the scene was just not for him, it's probably a combination of the two.
I got divorced, and life sort of caved in on me, and I said, I'll go back in show business. You can't find perfection in relationships, so I can find it in my work.
He had filled, as he said, a bag of jokes that he had been writing. So he had a wealth of material. So even though he had not been on the stage, he had been working on his act and working on his jokes.
It was like a fix, like I had to have it.
In 1962, at the age of 40, Rodney, now divorced from Joyce, set out a second time to conquer the world of comedy.
Then when I started doing my act, my friends, they weren't nice at all. They never told me good show. They used to tell me everything I did wrong. Gave me all kinds of advice, my friends, all kinds of advice. You should put a song in your act, put a girl in your act. You should do more in your act. You shouldn't do an act.
All of his friends discouraged him. They thought he was nuts.
He went on stage a couple of places, and all the club owners who knew him as Jack Roy, but they said, you know, you're almost 40 years old, Jack. It's a young you know, people's business now. We got young people like young Richard Pryor, George Carlin, Bill Cosby's this funny kid. Everybody knows you, but you're a used commodity, Jack.
With no support and no connections, Rodney struggled, playing small clubs and joints, but he still couldn't break through. His personal life was also in shambles, and being away from his young son made him miserable. So when Joyce pushed for them to get back together, Rodney finally said yes, and they were married a second time.
The second marriage was, we made a mistake the first time. Let's see if we can make this one work.
No, she's not smart. Are you kidding? Well, the second time she got pregnant, she thought we had to get married again, you know?
A year later, Rodney and Joyce had a daughter, Melanie. But even the addition of a new child couldn't cover the fact that the reunion wasn't working.
The lack of Rodney being around was a little bit too much for her. They had separate bedrooms, but even together, they were not together that much.
He was at rock bottom. The only thing that gave him a lift was getting back up on stage again.
Rodney told me, Billy, all I have is my act. That was his stable thing in life, his act. Everything revolved around that. And that's what kept him going.
Being a comic anytime is tough, but it's all about handling rejection. It has very little to do with being funny. It has to do with walking through that rejection, honing your craft, working hard on your material, which Rodney Dangerfield did relentlessly.
Unfazed by the rejection, Rodney continued to work hard on his act. And while he didn't know it at the time, his fortunes would soon change for the better when he gained a new image, quite by accident. After a failed first try at comedy, a failed marriage, and with no money in the bank, Rodney Dangerfield had re-entered show business at the age of 40.
Comedians, you basically have to fail at marriage and business and life before you even know that you're funny.
The experience he gained from his 10 years as a comedian and being older and more mature would soon begin to pay off.
Oh, what a crowd, what a crowd.
His timing was better. His jokes were better. And his name was about to get better.
Now, how can a name be a problem? Well, even William Shakespeare said, what's the name?
Who?
William Shakespeare.
Look, you want to listen to me or you want to listen to your friends?
I don't understand. Is it good to change your names? Does it really help?
Always help me. All right, look, right now I could give you a very good deal. A guy was in here last week, left me a big deposit on a great name. He never came back.
What's the name?
What's the name? Do I look like an idiot? This is a $1,000 name.
He went to a club that he had worked in the past, and the club owner always ran the names of the acts in the Friday paper, The Mirror. And Rodney wasn't sure he'd do very well. So instead of using the name Jack Roy, he told the club owner, George McFadden, to just make up a name.
So he made up a name. Rodney Dangerfield.
Rodney Dangerfield?
See? You just heard it. You're starting to say it. Listen to me. Take the name.
He was surprised that the name was Rodney Dangerfield. But it went so well that night, he killed. And he thought maybe that's the name for him. So it stuck and kind of became his lucky charm.
The new name helped, but it wasn't until Rodney created his new character that his luck truly began to change.
The first thing he came up with is, with me, nothing goes right.
I'll tell you, with me, nothing works out.
And then he would write jokes accordingly to that.
Every time I leave my house, my wife tells me to call her in case something goes right.
Rodney's new image and new brand of comedy soon showed results, earning him bookings in more prestigious venues.
When I read a review of this kid, Rodney Dangerfield, working at the Living Room on the East Side, the Living Room was his major breakthrough as Rodney Dangerfield. And he showed up the next night, drunk out of his mind, and of course he's a middle-aged slob. He bombed on stage. And the next night he comes back sober, says, I'm going on.
I mean, I'll tell you, my wife isn't too smart, you know. I told her our kid is spoiled. She told me a lot of kids smell that way, you know.
He goes up and he killed the room, racked it up, he said, and it became his room.
Rodney Dangerfield was honing his craft and getting hooked on the love that he could give and receive from an audience, because that would be the key to his life.
Rodney's career was on its way. But while he was doing well on the small stages, he knew at the age of 44, time was not on his side. He needed more exposure, and the way to get it was on the biggest variety show on television, The Ed Sullivan Show.
Getting on TV the first time, that's huge. If you hit, man, it's like that.
In those days, you weren't in show business if you didn't do Ed Sullivan. You know, that's how important it was to be on that show. And once you did Ed Sullivan, and a few times, then you had audience. Everybody knew who you were. If you were a total unknown, then you had to audition.
Rodney got his audition in 1966. It was a tough test, but Rodney told some of his favorite jokes.
My apartment, nothing but robberies. They're all over the place. Every time I close a window, I hit somebody's fingers.
Rodney had no trouble winning over the audience, but Sullivan proved to be harder.
Sullivan never called after that. I said, gee, what do you have to do, man?
I tell you, I don't get a break with nothing.
That's the most important thing for a comic, even today, is just getting on stage and being seen by somebody, and then you'll eventually be seen by someone and do TV. I remember Rodney said it was tough trying to get the Sullivan Show.
Rodney continued to sit by the phone and wait, his career hanging in the balance. After 3 anxious weeks, Ed finally called to give Rodney a spot on the show.
Hi. Well, that's right, Rodney Dangerfield. I mean, I figure if you're going to change your name, change it, you know?
Ed Sullivan was the catapult for Rodney. Also, the choice of that name was another wonderful thing. He finally got it all together the second time around.
Rodney earned $1,000 for his first appearance on Sullivan. And when it went well, he was booked more times at $1,500 a spot.
The Ed Sullivan Show, if you did well, if the ovation was good, better than normal, Ed Sullivan would call you back to take a bow.
And that's it.
So his ovation was good. So as the ovation is starting to dip a little bit, Ed Sullivan would be getting ready to bring on the next act. Rodney would, from behind the curtain, would peek his head out. The applause went sky high, and Ed Sullivan, encore, take a bow, Rodney. So Rodney would come out and take another bow, and then he would run back behind the curtain. Ed Sullivan never do that.
For Rodney, it was a very, very slow climb. In fact, even when he was doing Sullivan, he was still selling aluminum siding.
A customer said to his secretary, is Mr. Roy in show business? We saw him on the Ed Sullivan Show the other night. Oh, no, he does that on the side. On the side.
He shows up at this guy's house to do aluminum siding, and about 6 o'clock, he's doing the side, and he says to the guy, hey, you mind if I come in and watch the TV for a little while? The guy goes, okay. He turns on the TV, and Rodney's on TV, and he's watching himself, and the guy at the house is standing there and looking at him and looking at the TV going, what kind of alternate universe am I in? The guy who's doing my siding is on Sullivan.
With both his comedy career and his siding business going well, Rodney continued to hone his act, integrating a new wardrobe.
First time I did the Ed Sullivan Show, I got dressed, I wore a black suit and a red tie and a white shirt. Then I did well, and he brought me back to do another show. What am I going to wear the second time? I thought to myself, I don't know what to wear. I can't figure it out. I'll wear the same thing. So I got known for a red tie and a white shirt and a black suit quite by accident.
He also developed a manic style of delivery.
His mannerisms were individual. I mean, the reaching for the tie. No one else did it, because if you did do it, you thought of Dangerfield.
He was a fidgety guy. The sweat was real. The tics were real. He was constantly pulling, constantly nervous. So that was just part of him that worked for the character.
When you talk like Rodney Dangerfield...
I'll tell you, I'm all right now, but last week I was in rough shape, you know?
Some people, they think you're having a nervous breakdown. But when Rodney, that's his persona.
He walked out, and it looked like, hey, I just came in here, I want to tell you something. And it would look like an accident. Rodney looked like an accident to begin with, right? A four-car accident with no survivors. But It was no accident. He prepared those jokes, the routine of those jokes, the construction of the jokes.
Are you kidding? Are you kidding? I know I'm ugly. I asked the bartender to make me a zombie. Told me God beat him to it.
The classic Rodney Dangerfield joke is, oh, I was ugly. Where you set it up. I came out. That's the middle. The doctor slapped my mother. You know, it reverses right at the end, and it has the meaning. And he loved that type of joke.
I'll tell you, my wife, she never went for me. Well, the first time I called her up, she told me, come on over, there's nobody home. I went over, there was nobody home.
Rodney's new image was winning over audiences, and things would finally all come together when he stumbled upon what would become the greatest hook in the history of comedy. By 1967, Rodney Dangerfield's second stint in comedy began to show results. Armed with his new name and a new comedy angle that nothing goes right,
Well, I tell you, I don't get a break with nothing.
he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show and killed, gaining him fans all across America.
Boy, what a crowd, what a crowd.
And he would soon gain more notoriety when he came up with the greatest hook in the history of comedy.
It was just perfect. It was the most brilliant hook ever.
He tapped into a brand that spoke to everybody in America.
He had those wonderful bulging eyes, and the tick, and the great delivery, and of all things, that wonderful line.
No respect. I don't got no respect at all. You can That's the story of my life. No respect. I don't got no respect.
And the audience just cheered. It's like Tony Bennett's starting out with I Left My Heart in San Francisco. And now here it comes. This is what we're waiting for.
He just like popped the top and said, that's the story of my life, no respect. And that was it.
No respect at all. It's the same thing when I was a kid, no respect. The time my old man took me to the zoo. They thanked him for returning me.
From a kid who doesn't get to stay out and play longer, or the housewife and mother who works all day. At some point during the day, they go, I don't get no respect.
Rodney's no respect catchphrase hit a nerve with audiences everywhere, including one of his comedy idols.
Jack Benny just thought that Rodney had probably the best image there ever was for comedy. Jack Benny came down to Rodney's dressing room once and said, you know, my image is an image of a cheap guy. It's okay. And he said to Rodney, but your image gets into the soul of everybody. Everybody thinks they're not being respected.
Rodney's act even caught the eye of his father, Phil, who Rodney reconciled with not long before he died.
In later life, when he got to know his father, he sympathized with his father. He realized that his mother was such a bad time and such a horrible person that he forgave his father. He understood why his father abandoned him, because he had to get away from the mother.
That helped him sort of forgive his father. When he finally reconciled with his father, he made the comment to him that, hey, I supported your wife for 40 years.
He cried to me and said to me, will you forgive me? You know what I mean? Will you forgive me? I says, yeah, forget about it. Won't worry about that stuff, you know? But actually, as far as I was concerned, and seeing his own kid, he was not that nice. You know, he had his own life and lived it.
He knew he was starting to get a good reaction from the audiences, and he had booked this gig in Long Island with 400 people, and he brought his dad to that show. His dad said, you know, I think you've got something. And Rodney never forgot that. And he was so glad that that approval came before his father passed.
As Rodney's stand-up career began to pick up steam, he was able to ditch his 9-to-5 selling aluminum siding. He was playing the Copacabana, the Latin Casino, and the Living Room. And thanks to the exposure he was getting on Ed Sullivan, every show on TV wanted him.
I says, he is a naturally funny man, but he stays in a box. He knows what he's going to say.
I mean, ugly. But when I was born, after the doctor cut the cord, he hung himself.
He never deviated.
My old man, he didn't like my looks either. But he carried around a picture of the kid who came with the wallet.
That generation really knew where they came from and really knew how gifted and lucky and grateful that it was to be a comedian and an entertainer like that. And that all showed up.
Are you kidding? I know I'm ugly. Halloween, I open the front door, kids give me candy.
Rodney's hard work was paying off. But there was still one venue he had yet to conquer. And at the time, it was the single most important stage in the country.
When you were on Johnny Carson and successful, that was like being on American Idol today. That made you a national attraction.
That 5.5 minutes, more people will see you on that monologue than if you played, say, this nightclub here 3 times a day, you know, for like 50 years. So you better treat that 6 minutes like it's like gold.
Johnny Carson got 20 to 25 million viewers a night. The whole country watched the Johnny Carson show. And most importantly, the whole industry watched the Tonight Show.
If you didn't get on the Tonight Show, you weren't happening. You also could end your career there, too. And if he said, sit down, that was the ultimate.
Not only could Rodney not get a sit-down with Carson, he couldn't even get booked on the show because of a mistake he had made years earlier.
No, I tell you, I'm all right now, but last week I was a rough shape, you know?
He had been at the Improv, and he wrote a very funny joke, and it got a pretty good laugh at the club. And yet, a few days later, it was coming out of Johnny Carson's mouth. He was so upset that he wrote a letter to Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson was very upset with the letter. Didn't really know Rodney, and he said, who is this guy that's saying that I have a thief on the staff? And Johnny did not want to use Rodney for the longest time.
A few years later, a couple of the talent bookers came up to him after a performance and said, okay, you got to do Johnny's show. And Rodney said, I'd like to, but, you know, he doesn't want me. And they said, oh, he's forgotten about that. He's forgotten about that by now. And so they booked a date, and Rodney was like, oh, so happy, and telling everyone, calling everybody. And then his phone rang, and, well, guess what? Johnny's not over it.
Finally, fate intervened, and Rodney had a chance meeting with his old friend Stan Irwin, who was a Tonight Show producer, and Johnny himself.
One night, Rodney was at the Copacabana, where Tony Bennett was on in 1969. And Johnny Carson pulled up in a limo with Stan Irwin, his producer, and saw the crowd just trying to get in and decided to give up. Rodney personally set him up with a table for 2. And Rodney looked at Johnny and said, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Johnny said, forget about it, and the next thing he knew...
Would you welcome Mr. Rodney Dangerfield?
And Rodney became a national institution just from how much Johnny liked him.
I tell you, last week was a rough week for me last week. I saw my kid and the milkman going to a father and son dinner.
It was great. He'd come in, 6 minutes of all home runs. Rodney was not interested in entertaining an audience. He wanted to pulverize them. He wanted to kill them.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rodney Dangerfield.
He wanted to leave him on the floor left.
I tell you, I'm all right now, but last week I was in rough shape, you know? Last week I saw my doctor. I told him, Doc, every day I wake up, I look in the mirror, I want to throw up. What's wrong with me? He said, I don't know, but your eyesight is perfect.
You should tell me, when you go on the Carson show, you got to do damage. You got to do damage.
I mean, the last time I made love to my wife, it was ridiculous. Nothing was happening. I looked at her, I said, what's the matter? Can't you think of anyone either?
There was a stand-up and there was the panel part. Which can I deliver to Johnny, and which do I want to play to the audience with? This was all part of the craft.
He just killed Johnny. I mean, Johnny would literally cry, and he was one of the few that could do that in the industry.
I'll tell you, all you hear is sex with sex. I had it up to here.
Yeah.
Not lately, though, you know?
I don't think I ever saw Johnny Carson laugh as long or as loud as when Rodney was next to him.
Well, those are the best clips, you know, when you see Johnny Carson laughing, and he was such a great setup man with Rodney, so they had a fun chemistry.
It used to take me 3 months to prepare a talk show. Between the stand-up and the panel, I needed 32 new jokes that were all funny, this and that, and that's how long it would take me to prepare 6 or 8 minutes.
When he would write a joke, he would literally write a joke. I mean, he would start maybe with a thought and write that down, and then he'd keep kind of adding to it and reworking it and reworking it.
Well, last week I went to the track. I showed off the opening gun. They killed my horse.
Every show that he did on television is handwritten. Mike Douglas, Merv Griffin, Steve Allen's show, every show that he did.
With Carson on his resume, Rodney could now command tens of thousands of dollars in Vegas, but he was about to be confronted with a traumatic event that would force him to choose between his career and his family. By 1969, at the age of 48, Rodney Dangerfield's struggles in the world of show business finally seemed over.
Would you welcome Mr. Rodney Dangerfield?
His success on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show
Rodney Dangerfield
made him a national phenomenon, and he could now command tens of thousands of dollars playing Las Vegas. But once again, life would deal Rodney Dangerfield a cruel blow.
I had a domestic situation at home where my wife was ill and she couldn't give the kids proper attention.
Joyce was stricken with debilitating arthritis and began drinking to cope with her condition.
It seemed to be like a seesaw. As his success went up, hers deteriorated physically and even mentally. So she had lost the spirit that she formerly had, I believe, because he said, you can't believe it's the same woman, Eddie. He was in love with the memory that he had of her, but he also was aware enough that it was just a memory, that he couldn't get that back.
Rodney also remembered his neglected childhood and made the tough decision to forego the paydays and the chance to become an even bigger star to stay close to home and be a father to his children.
And here he was famous. He was Rodney Dangerfield, and there was a big demand for him to go on the road.
The job of a stand-up comic is crowded, so crowded. And just to get a little bit of attention is so difficult. And when you have a little attention, you want more. You don't just walk away because you got to raise some kids. Who does that? Rodney did.
But he decided to open up his own club and put his name on it. Kind of like Ricky Ricardo with the Club Babalu, you know, just going to work every day and being there for the kids and just going and working at nighttime.
At this time, say hello to my partner, Anthony Bavacqua here. Tony, take him out, will you?
Rodney hooked up with friend Anthony Bavacqua to open Dangerfield's on New York's East Side. Everyone thought he was crazy.
Well, he's a great guy. He's a real workaholic, you know. Hey, you mention work, he gets drunk.
When Rodney talked to his friends about opening the club and trying to borrow a few bucks, his friend says, "You're going to open a club with a bass player?" All clubs were closing. Copacabana closed, the Persian Room closed, and we're opening a club, so they all thought we were nuts.
And I know he borrowed some money, and that was a big deal for Rodney. He didn't like being in debt.
It was difficult, but we did it because Rodney had credibility. He was on shows already. He was doing TV.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rodney Dangerfield.
So we gathered up enough money to get the place open.
Rodney's name recognition
and Dangerfield's okay, David Fry,
and his ability to plug the club anytime he did a television appearance made Dangerfield's an instant success.
The first year, the club was really successful, and he paid off everybody that he borrowed the money from, and it was a big hit right away.
But true to form, Rodney's continued success still didn't get him any respect.
He said to me, he says, you know, here I am, I got my own club, I'm trying to do well, and this woman came up for me, Eddie, and she said, Rodney, could I have your autograph and some more butter?
By 1970, Dangerfield's was thriving. Sadly, though, Joyce's condition continued to deteriorate, and after years of suffering, she passed away, leaving Rodney alone to raise Melanie, age 7, and Brian, age 11.
It was sort of a fatalistic thing that it was coming. I don't know if relief is the word, but it was an acceptance of the reality of that he was prepared for it.
Rodney Dangerfield was now a single father of 2 small children and approaching the age of 50. He knew time wasn't on his side, but he continued running Dangerfield's while Melanie and Brian grew up.
He had his priorities right. Raised his children once they were adults, once they had their own lives. Once his responsibility was over, he went back and became even bigger than he was.
The first step in the explosion of Rodney's career was a meeting with some alums from National Lampoon and Second City. They were about to shoot a low-budget movie called Caddyshack.
He was approached by the 3 writers, Brian Doyle Murray and Doug Kinney and Harold Ramis.
Our first thought was that maybe Don Rickles should play the part. But at the time, Rodney had an amazing run on The Tonight Show. He was killing every time, just hysterically funny. And I forgot who first said it, but we said, you know, maybe Rodney's the guy. We didn't know that if he could act, but we thought even if he couldn't act, just being himself would work for us.
And he said, I have reservations about this. I said, why? He said, I'm not doing it, he said, unless I can add lines. I said, Rodney, they're going to be more than happy for you to do lines in the movie.
He liked the part, and he took a $35,000 flat fee to make the movie. Not only did he work for $35 grand, he passed up a couple of very lucrative $50,000 gigs in Vegas to make Caddyshack. So he actually lost money making the movie.
Rodney, to me, stole the movie. He had the most quotable lines.
Hey, kid, I'm Al Chervik. I'm playing with Drew Scott today. This is my guest, Mr. Wang. No offense.
I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, hey, they just let him go.
I'm not even sure if he knew that he was stealing that movie when he did it.
Oh, I can maybe have a half a dozen of those Vulcan D10s and set my friend up here with the whole schmear. You know, clubs, bags, shoes, gloves, shirt, pants. Hey, orange balls. I'll have a box of those. Give me a box of those naked lady tees, and give me 2 of those. Give me 6 of those.
There aren't that many comedians today that could take jokes from their act and stick them into a movie. You know, Groucho Marx could do it. W.C. Fields could do it.
Oh, this is the worst looking hat I ever saw. Well, you buy a hat like this, I'll bet you get a free bowl of soup, huh?
And Rodney can do it, too.
Oh, it looks good on you, though.
So we worked on his first day's shooting, and I said, all right, action. Rodney, action? He says, you want me to do the bit? I said, yeah, do the bit. Okay, so he was so raw, he didn't even understand that action was the signal to start. But the punchline to that is, by the end of the shoot, he finished the scene and he came over to me and he said, I guess I'm an actor.
The first scene he ever shot, he starts to sweat. I said, oh my God, this guy's gonna have a heart attack. I go, you know, so in between takes, I go, Rodney, are you okay? No, no. I said, what's the matter? He said, I suck, I'm stuck. I'm dying out there. I said, what do you mean? Nobody's laughing. Nobody's laughing. I said, Rodney, they can't laugh. Right, because I suck. I said, Rodney, they can't laugh because they won't be able to use the soundtrack.
Caddyshack went on to gross nearly $40 million in the U.S. alone and landed at number 17 for the year 1980, higher than such critically acclaimed films as Raging Bull and The Elephant Man. But its real effect can be seen in the avid cult following it's developed over the years.
Caddyshack may be the most perfect comedy. It has a wonderful flow. It has some archetypical characters that are just perfect. And Rodney, one of the funniest guys ever, at his absolute peak.
Most comedians, that's probably one of their top 10 movies of all time. And it's what we call a road movie. It's something when we get on the bus or get on a plane, we take literally with us and we watch. And it stands up still today, 20-some years later.
Yeah, I tell you, with girls, I never had any luck, you know.
Rodney, never one to rest on his laurels, kept coming as fast and frantic as his stand-up act, starring in a series of commercials for light beer from Miller.
I tell you, I don't get no respect. Hey, I'll keep the change. Here's Rodney!
The focus was to appeal to the average Joe six-pack, and Rodney's image fit to a T.
All we need is one pin, Rodney.
In 1983, at the age of 61, Rodney took a page from his own life to make the movie Easy Money, starring as hard-living slob Monty Capuletti.
This was like the height of his popularity, and he goes, so they want to do a movie starring me. So if you come up with an idea, let me know. So by the next night, I had this idea of just, you know, a guy has to stop drinking, smoking, and gambling for a year to get $10 million. He thought, that's a good idea.
Rodney said of all of his movies, that particular character was most like the real him.
I'm very familiar with him, and there's a part of me that's part of him, too, you know? The idea that a good time is going to the track and having a few drinks and gambling. That's part of me, too, my personal life. It's hard to contain myself, and that's where we got the idea for the movie.
Comedy comes from tragedy, and that could not be more true about anyone more than Rodney Dangerfield. He really was a tortured soul who turned it into a lot of jokes and making everyone else laugh, but he didn't laugh a lot himself.
Rodney continued to mine his troubled past to fuel his comedy, and he would soon become a comic legend to a new group of fans with a movie that would become his greatest triumph.
Showbiz is a tough racket. I mean, I'm doing okay.
By the mid-'80s, Rodney Dangerfield had put his past failures behind him by becoming the biggest thing in stand-up comedy.
Rodney Dangerfield, exposed.
As well as a success in TV and movies. His next project would gain Rodney an entirely new audience, adding a whole new chapter to his legacy. In the process, the film would become one of the top-grossing movies of 1986. But it took an old friend to help him realize the full potential of his concept.
He said, I'm doing this movie where I go back to school with my son. And I said, yeah, that's interesting. He said, yeah, I'm going to play this guy. He said he's a top putz. He's a total loser, you know, and he has nowhere to go, and his wife leaves him, and his business fails, and he's forced to go back to college. And I said, well, you know, my fantasy about going back to college is that I go back with all the money I've got now and knowing what I know now as a grown-up. College would be great.
Could have changed here.
I don't change in front of guys. I mean, the next thing you know, you're showering with the fellas. And the next thing you know, you're pinned to a sophomore named Chip.
He was working on the script constantly, always in his robe. I remember going by one night to wherever he was staying, and there he was in his robe, but working away, you know. I mean, so much of the funny things that happened in that movie were inspired by him.
How about tomorrow night?
I have class then, too.
I'll tell you what, then. Why don't you call me sometime when you have no class?
One of my favorite films of the early 80s, he plays a father who goes back to school. He's so irreverent. He's the soul of comedy. A man of that age who's a money-greedy materialist wants to go back to college so he can pick up girls, and he embarrasses his son is a great idea.
It's a jungle out there. You got to look out for number one, but don't step at number two.
It was a classic comedy, I thought, Back to School.
Back to School grossed more than $100 million at the box office and became a cult hit with the college audience. An audience that became one of Rodney's most rabid groups of fans. Rodney was now 65 years old, and after nearly 50 years of disappointments and failures,
I mean, that's the story of my life. No respect. I got no respect at all.
He had finally climbed to the top of the comedy world. Mindful of his struggles, Rodney embraced a group of young comedians and used his stature to help jumpstart their careers.
I know how tough it is for a comedian when he starts. And if I see a guy who I think is funny, it's my pleasure to try to move him along. Here, let the people see him.
He appreciated talent.
In this thing called showbiz, he's one of the guys who's coming up real fast.
And I like that about Rodney Dangerfield. He admired other comics because he loved the art of comedy.
Robert Townsend is really dynamite. Okay.
Rodney had a lot of empathy for comedians, so he knew how difficult it was.
Give it up for Robert Schimmel, okay?
He genuinely had a daddy motivation where he kind of felt the need to nurture.
I'm going to hire both of you.
Rodney was offered by HBO a series of stand-up comedy specials where he would bring in stand-up comics and feature them on his HBO specials.
He was the doorkeeper. He was able to open doors for guys that he really liked.
All right, give it up now for Tim Allen, okay? Here we go. All right, Tim, here we go, baby. All right.
Most of the people that were on those shows became superstars.
All right.
It was a big break for them in show business to be on a show with Rodney Dangerfield.
Men are pigs, right, ladies? Yeah. Yeah, just too bad we own everything.
He really loved comedy. He appreciated a good joke, as well as he appreciated a new character.
I don't even know what it takes to get a cab driver's license. I think all you need is a face. This seems to be their big qualification. And a name with like 8 consonants in a row.
Rodney was responsible for a whole bunch of superstars. Seinfeld, Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey was his opening act, which he was very proud of. Andrew Dice Clay, Roseanne Barr. Just all of these people became superstars.
Since God, Roseanne, I cannot even remember the last time we had sex. Well, I can, and that's why we ain't doing it.
People were always talking about it, and, you know, it was like, there were so many people that shot out. Now, he had such a good eye for talent. Mr. Macho, he says, excuse me, fellas, I have to go home to pork my wife. What kind of talk is this to pork a person? A human being you are talking about, not a farm animal. To booger my babe, to hump My honey, to lace some pipe, to hide the salami, to bury the bone, to stop. You know, it really, really helped me. Nothing ever helped me like that.
I mean, Sam Kinison, nobody would ever give Sam Kinison or Andrew Dice Clay, you know, primetime TV. It was unheard of back then, those kinds of comedians.
Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Long came a Spidey, sat down beside he said, "Hey, what's in the bowl?"
Dice was on for 7 minutes, and he became an arena act, which meant he was selling out 15,000 seaters based on 7 minutes on Rodney's HBO special, which was a phenomena.
You're gonna get a kick out of Bad Sam, okay, Sammy West?
Sam Kinison was rebellious. Sam was having a tough time in the business because he was different. People were afraid of him because his comedy was extreme.
I'm not like the others. No, this is new love. Come on, trust me, trust me. I wouldn't lie to you 10 times in a row. Come on! Come on, open the door. Let's see what she's like. I thought it was the door to love. It was the door to hell!
I think he enjoyed people that were really unique and had their own voice. And he always championed people that were, you know, offbeat.
He would find a place for you if he really enjoyed what you did and believed in you. And that was so rare. It just shows how generous he was. Most comics are very threatened by other funny people.
He would help us out. Sometimes we would sell him jokes that he'd never use because he knew we needed the money, and he allowed us to keep our dignity, you know. Some really bad material I sold him over the years.
Just having Rodney know you and think you're funny was like a, you know, you carry it with you like a badge of honor. As a young guy back then, I was like, that was huge for me and for my confidence.
Rodney was really, really very strong on being true to yourself. He said, don't ever change for anyone else. When you walk out on stage and if you go, God, these guys look a little conservative, they came to see you. Don't change for them. You do your thing.
How do blind people know when they're done wiping their Honey, could you come here for a minute? I need you to proofread something for me.
To wind up having a guy that you idolized introducing me as one of his favorite comics, it can't get much better than that. It really can't. I mean, I got to live a dream.
Besides helping these young comedians to live their dreams, Rodney's specials generated huge television ratings for HBO.
Let's keep the applause going for the other guys. They're really great.
With his career humming along, Rodney should have been enjoying his success. But away from the stage, he was still haunted by the old demons.
When the roar of the crowd is over, you're alone then after the show. You look for someone to hang out with, you know what I mean? I'm still alone. I can't find no one to hang out with.
But things were about to change for the better, thanks to a chance meeting with a young woman more than 30 years his junior. In 1986, Rodney was fresh off the $100 million box office of Back to School, as well as a series of HBO specials that helped launch the careers of some of the most important rising stars in comedy. But in spite of all this success, Rodney still struggled when he wasn't on stage. All that would change, though, thanks to a kindred spirit, 30-year-old Joan Child.
I met Rodney at a flower shop that I owned in Santa Monica. He was staying at Pritikin Longevity Center at the time, trying to kick a few bad habits like smoking and drinking. And he happened to walk right past my flower shop, and we struck up a conversation, and our romance just sort of blossomed.
I looked at the flowers too much, I guess, and then I started looking at Joan, and whatever happened after that.
We basically just hung out together all the time and went to comedy clubs, which was fun. And occasionally, Rodney treated me to an all-night deli. We had a really, really great time.
Rodney finally found the love he'd been looking for his entire life.
Rodney Dangerfield.
Back on stage, he continued to live the rock and roll lifestyle, playing to sell-out crowds all over the country.
What the is going on here, huh?
He sold tickets like a rock and roll comic. And his audience, which was also a lot of beer drinking, it was, you know, people came for the party. It wasn't a Neil Sedaka concert. You know, it was, let's go party. We're here to rock.
What do you say we bust up this joint? Bust it wide open, are you kidding?
My wife and I are at one of Rodney's shows, and Jim Carrey opened for him, and you know, it's like a comic opening for a rock star. Get the off the stage, bring out Rodney, we don't you, get out. And poor Jim Carrey left the stage in tears. I thought he was going to leave the business.
I'm not going to lie to you. I got to act smart here and say my favorite place to work is Las Vegas. And the audience here at Bally's is the best audience in the whole world. Man, bullshit. I can't wait to get the out of here, okay?
In 1991, Rodney Dangerfield turned 70 years old.
That's all right, that's all right.
And his hard lifestyle began to take a toll.
I'll see you around, huh? Take it easy.
Pushing him into the worst depression of his life.
Rodney was doing a New Year's Eve performance, and one of his carotid arteries closed off, and he suffered a stroke. And he had to have surgery. It was a very difficult surgery for him to recover from.
The deeper you get into pulling that curtain back, I think it can make you sad. Rodney, as he got older, was very, very sad about that his body wasn't keeping up with him.
He had just kind of shut down and was, you know, wondering what life was all about. It was just this horrible period in his life.
I was sitting in a balcony way high up, and you get thoughts for the moment. Says, what the heck? This is, you can't win. What's the point? This and that. And I had all horrible thoughts of ending it.
What stopped him was the fear that he wouldn't die. And thank goodness that stopped him. But the depression was something that just hung over him, that he had to battle every day.
And today I'm still depressed. I found a good psychiatrist, a great guy, and he put me on antidepressant pills. He had the right ones for me, and I'm okay now.
After a 10-year courtship, Rodney and Joan were married on December 26, 1993.
You never know when a love bug will bite you, huh? I was sure I'd never get married again, and Joan felt she'd never get married. So we solved two problems at once then. We got married.
Joan made a miraculous change in his life. She had actually addressed his issues in a way. He just got more organized and actually had a life, instead of being that, you know, kind of bachelor, you know, living alone in the hotels. You know, suddenly he had someone to come home to.
Another major change came when Oliver Stone called Rodney to cast him in his new movie, Natural Born Killers, the shocking, violent story of two psychopathic serial killers who go on a nationwide murdering spree.
He was my first choice for Dad, because I just pictured the father as somebody who was partially insane and also at the same time could operate within the confines of a sitcom.
What are you wearing, a broomstick and a trash bag? Why don't you put some meat on you, huh? A few pounds lighter, you'll be Miss Ethiopia.
It was a drastic departure from his usual lovable loser persona.
I brought him this script, and he thought I was crazy to want to cast him. He says, what's so funny about this? You know, he playing a role of a father who abuses his daughter and his wife and his son, who's a monster. He honestly, and I would say, but it's funny, Rodney, don't you understand? And I still have a vivid memory of sitting in this trailer in Arizona, arguing with Rodney Dangerfield about what was funny.
I'm going to the John Lee Hooker concert with Donna. I told you that yesterday.
First off, you don't tell me anything. You asked my permission. Second, you're not going out in that hula house dress. You'll end up peddling your you stupid. And third, you're not going out at all. You didn't mow the yard.
That piece of lawnmower is...
I've lived it. I've seen it. And so I could play that part. of a terrible person, and I was the worst.
So what's it like making the movie, Rodney? He'd go, you know when you want to punish a kid, you make him write something 100 times? That's what making a movie is like. That's the way he felt. Just, you know, just like tedium, and he liked the idea of doing it. Hey, look at me, I'm in the movies, you know. But the actual process, not for him.
He played emotions like just the broadest, rawest kind of, you know, depiction of a feeling. But, you know, that outlandishness really worked when he was cast right.
By the age of 73, Rodney Dangerfield had become a living legend in the world of entertainment. But as he approached his 80s, his health continued to fail, forcing Rodney to come face to face with his own mortality. As the 1990s came to a close, Rodney Dangerfield was approaching his 80s, and his years of heavy smoking, drinking, and drug use were beginning to catch up with him.
You know, when you get old, you get certain signs. I walked past a cemetery, 2 guys ran after me with shovels.
His health was deteriorating, and in the year 2000, he underwent double bypass surgery. It was the first of several difficult surgeries he would undergo over the next few years. But though Rodney wasn't feeling his best, he never stopped working. He continued to do stand-up and appeared in several movies, including a cameo role as Lucifer in Adam Sandler's Little Nicky.
He was so thrilled that, a fellow comic would offer him a part in a movie. It had never happened before, and Rodney was just honored to do that. And it gave him a chance to get to know Adam a little bit.
He seemed like a guy to me that never wanted the laughter to stop. That if he could keep bringing it for centuries and centuries to people, he would.
He never gave up. Even I saw him close to the end, and he was still fighting to make movies.
He didn't have to work as hard as he did. Not only was he doing his act, but he was also still trying to do movies. And it got tougher and tougher, but, he just wanted to make people laugh.
On November 22nd, 2001, Rodney turned 80 years old and had a special appearance on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, where a comedian he helped on his way up paid him a special tribute.
It was his birthday, and he went and he started doing his material and sat down, and Jay Leno said, "We have a surprise for you, surprise guest." Jim Carrey walks in.
When Jim walked out, it was a big emotional moment for Rodney. He was just thrilled. And they were saying happy birthday, and all of the festivities took place, and hugging and happiness.
The happiness would be short-lived, however. As that same night, after the show, Rodney Dangerfield suffered a minor heart attack.
You were 17 yesterday, you'll be 50 tomorrow. Get older, doctors tell you don't smoke, don't drink, eat certain foods at my age. What can I look forward to? Now, from this point on, if I take excellent care of myself, I'll get very sick and die.
Not only did his medical problems not stop Rodney from working, they also didn't curb his love for marijuana.
At my age, I should be reading the papers. I'm looking to roll them.
Under the compassionate use law, the state of California granted him medical marijuana approval. He could smoke whenever he wanted, legally.
I was in the ICU with him at one of his surgeries, and I walk in there, and there's these oxygen tanks that say no smoking, and Rodney's lighting up a joint, right? And he's smoking, and Harry, man, how are you, okay? And I'm in there, Rodney, you're supposed to be, man, it's okay, I draw, you could do anything when you draw.
Rodney continued to draw praise for his comedic career, and in 2002, he was honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He was also recognized by the Smithsonian Institute, who put his trademark black suit, white shirt, and red tie on display. But among the accolades, Rodney was continuing to deteriorate.
You know when you're really old? When your family talks about you in front of you.
At that point, he was starting not only to have the fatigue and shortness of breath from his cardiac problem, but he was also beginning to have episodes where he almost fainted.
There's a funny memo where his doctor called the front desk at the building that he lived in and left a message. The doctor said, you have to have brain surgery before you have your heart surgery. That's it. And he goes, these are the messages I get, Rodney wanted to live. He wanted to keep working.
Once he recovered from the surgery, his symptoms started falling away. He was sharper, He had less fatigue, and he was already starting to talk about planning his next performance.
Less than a month after undergoing brain surgery, Rodney made a surprise appearance at the Laugh Factory.
Rodney a little bit looked fragile, and I walked him to the stage. And I remember after first and second joke he said, he got this rolling laughter. That audience gave him life. That audience, that laughter, that applause gave him energy. It was amazing. I never seen anything like that. I thought it was the most amazing thing I ever seen any human being doing on the stage.
Despite his failing health, Rodney continued to work, and in 2004, he published his autobiography, It's Not Easy Being Me, a lifetime of no respect, but plenty of sex and drugs. It went on to be a New York Times and national bestseller. But success couldn't forestall the inevitable.
I remember him saying to me, he goes, hey, you know, Harland, I'm in my 80s now. Only 10% of people make it out of their 80s. It's strange to see people kind of looking at the clock, and especially when you have a person that offers so much and brings joy to people in their life while they're alive. It's kind of hard to see that in a person.
On August 24, 2004, Dangerfield went back to UCLA for heart valve replacement surgery. Never one to miss a punchline. When asked how long he'd be hospitalized, he said if all goes well, about a week. If not, about an hour and a half. On August 24, 2004, at the age of 82, Rodney Dangerfield was admitted to UCLA Medical Center for heart valve replacement surgery.
After Rodney's final heart surgery, he slipped into a coma and was in the coma for 40 days. They pretty much let me try everything to try to bring him out. And part of that included they gave me permission to bring in beyond family, other people that had strong emotional connections to him. And I got on the phone and called a few comics. And they all knew the mission. Try to say something that maybe Rodney would react to. I heard some of the best material in the world from Jay Leno, Jim Carrey, Adam Sandler. Louis Anderson came almost every day. Bob Saget, Andrew Dice Clay, Roseanne. And we just thought there was hope. There was a chance.
Is he in there? Is he hearing me? You know, I held his hand, I talked to him, I did all those things that you would do with any person you loved. I just thought, man, this guy should be alive.
On October 5th, 2004, at 1:20 p.m., Rodney Dangerfield passed away from complications of heart surgery. He was 82. A memorial was held for him a few days later at Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles.
His funeral literally was a command performance. It was the who's who of comedy anywhere.
We all had one thing in common. Rodney at one time had said, hey, you know, you're funny. You're original. Hang in there, baby, or whatever it was. And it lifted us up.
It was amazing. A tribute to a life well lived.
That room was tragic and sad and happy and laugh. It was so much emotion.
We were all sad about why we were there, but everybody was starstruck. You know, everywhere you looked, You know, there was just these huge comedy stars, and that just is a testament to what a great man he was and what a comedy legend he was.
What a crowd, what a crowd. The other day I told my kid, I said, someday you'll have children of your own. He said, so will you. Now, last week I noticed my gums were shrinking. I was brushing my teeth with preparation H. Well, last week my house was on fire. My wife told the kids, be quiet, you'll wake up Daddy.
Rodney is the only comic I can think of where guys get together and they'd all start quoting jokes of his.
She can't cook at all. How can toast have bones, you know? The garbage disposal threw up. She made my kid alphabet soup. He spelled out help.
I'll tell you, my wife is loose. You know, she's a tramp. She's like FedEx. She absolutely has to be there overnight.
It's all about not getting respect. You know, my wife likes to talk during sex. Last week, she called me from a motel.
He said, I went to my first orgy last week, you know. It was the first time I had to apologize to a group of people.
I saw a guy running naked down the street. I said, what are you doing? He said, you're home early.
I'll tell my wife she can't drive. The other day, she hit a tree. She said it wasn't her fault. She blew the horn. I took my wife to the zoo. They thanked me for bringing her back.
You know, my family, during the Civil War, they fought for the West.
My wife, she's a lousy cook. At my house, we pray after we eat.
He had extremely clever material. You have to look at his stuff is really what. I was so ugly when I was born, they slapped my mother.
And I liked hanging out with him.
I want to improve my personality.
Good luck. It was funny. He was so unusual. Every moment you spent with him, you knew was kind of there was going to be an anecdote later about it.
He was special. There's not many Rodney Dangerfields that come along. He's a unique individual.
You know, Rodney, I think, as funny as he was, I think he deserves a special place in our hearts because he helped lift up so many funny people.
He gave me the greatest gift you could ever give from one comic to another. I got to have an idol introduce me to the world on television. What more could you ask for that? I mean, if he was alive, I couldn't repay him.
Rodney was like a father to me. He did a lot to help launch a lot of people's careers, mine included. Unbelievable amount of respect. There's not a day that goes by where I'm not telling somebody a story about Rodney or thinking about him. You know, he touched my life so much.
Rodney Dangerfield is one of the great, unique stand-up comics to have ever graced the stage, and
last week I was a rough shape, you know?
He was a legend.
Really one of my heroes, you know, I think for a lot of comics coming up. He was just brilliant.
Rodney Dangerfield is the best comedian I ever met. God, I'm sappy. But he is. He's the best comedian. I mean, I'd have to say, all in all, the character, the jokes, the whole thing, the whole package, he's the best.
Hey, I'm very blessed to have spent so many years with one of the most brilliant comics ever. It's just an amazing, amazing experience.
Rodney's one of these guys you think of and you smile. You smile a lot. They should have made more of him.
I mean, but God, he was so hip. And a great comic artist. I miss Rodney. God, it's tough not to.
I don't think he really believed he was that good. But the audience said, yes, you're wonderful. And he was. And that's it.
And, you know, he always say, hey, you got no respect, you know, no respect. In reality, all he did was get respect.
I mean, that's the story of my life. No respect. I got no respect.
Rodney Dangerfield was bigger than life. He was worth every nickel you ever paid to see him. He gave everybody full value. He gave you laughter for your time, for your money, and your effort to come out and see him. He loved you.
Rodney is a series of memories and jokes and great performances, and he will be remembered. And can't wait for the next generation of kids to ask me about Rodney Dangerfield, because some great stories to tell and some fantastic jokes. And that would be something he'd be very proud of.
I just wish that everyone had the chance that I had to spend so much time with him and to see his humanity and his generous spirit. I was the luckiest girl in the world.
Like everyone else in this thing called showbiz, I like applause, but I'll tell you, there's something to me that's more important than applause. May mean nothing to you, but a lot to me. It's just when I walk off, if you'd all just give me one of these.